Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about DDI Codebook version 2.6. Our presenter today will be Wendy Thomas, Chair of the DDI Technical Committee. Wendy.
Hi, I know that DDI Codebook version 2.6 has been long awaited, so let's get going. Mm, Okay, just a moment. I have to get off of. There we go. It was not moving forward. Okay, I just wanted to remind people of the general steps in the publication process. Um, in publication. I was a little iterative there. We did create a codebook working group. It was a subgroup of the technical committee. This was back in 2020, 2001. We had to have something to do during the COVID crisis. And this group, there were about 20 to 25 people. We were well represented by people from CESDA, from people from Dataverse and the World Bank. These are some of our major users of DDI Codebook. Um, we did a number of technical reviews in 2023, 24, and 25. Many of them were long running, and those were the technical and beta reviews. Those were done publicly. And then in January, we put out the public review for release candidate, and we've had a number of issues that were raised in there, and most of those have either been typographical, and thank you for those of you who have caught those kinds of errors, as well as just the application of uh, some of the general points that I will be talking about in a few minutes. Those will be cleaned up and those issues will be addressed prior to the publication of the final package, which will take place after a vote, um, which is starting right after this webinar, as soon as uh, Jared can get information out the door, and it will last for a month. Um, Obviously, we're doing the webinar for the voting members right now. This is a new feature that we started in the last few um, product uh, product vote processes. We find that it gives the voters a better understanding of what they are reviewing and what it is that they're saying in terms of their votes, and a better understanding of just the overall factors of the changes in the content, so that they can focus in their review information. Once we have the response to the vote, if it is positive, we will carry on with creating the final publication package. If it does not pass, then we will address those issues that were raised and caused concerns. Following the development of 2.6, the technical committee will be proposing the establishment of a DDI codebook working group. Our aim is to make sure that there is a working group for all of our major products, and that group will monitor issues as they will arise, and also address ongoing concerns in terms of aligning the products, improving the interoperability, increasing the publication implementation options across a broader range than just XML. So that is coming after. If these are things that you're interested in, you will be seeing announcements of that as it moves through the scientific board for approval. The purpose and scope of version 2.6 is we have not changed its development rules. We continues to have the rule of backwards compatibility, by which we mean that if you took an older instance of Codebook and changed the version number and parsed it against the current uh, XML schema, that it would still be valid. This causes a number of difficulties in terms of overall development, because of the way it was started as a DTD and carries over a number of the features of that, and it limits um, it limits how we can expand in terms of changing cardinality from 0 to 1 to say 0 to n when things are attributes. There's a variety of places where we're getting into a corner in some of this. And that will be a question that will be put to the development committee for future development of codebook. Um, but our other purposes were to facilitate the use of external controlled vocabularies. Um, we had at one time, in 2.5, we had put in a system for being able to indicate controlled vocabularies in a separate section and then link them. This only worked in XML because it used XML linking features in terms of applying a controlled vocabulary to a particular object. And so we're expanding where and how you can use a controlled vocabularies, making sure that it has additional features in it um, to actually explicitly indicate which item within a code vocabulary is being referenced. Um, Similarly, we're adding the use of personal and persistent identifiers for individuals and organizations at the object level, um, support for multiple levels of access to data and metadata, additional places to capture access rules, but also ways to link from specific objects to those access rules. These are things that we'll go on to in more detail. Um, we have improved the incorporation of SDTL through some minor changes in addition to uh, a new section within the file descriptions that allows people to explain where, if they have a derived file, how that file was derived and the process that took place to create it. And then we are looking at expanding and regularizing the documentation. Um, we have gone through and structurally changed the internal documentation within the schema so that it is more consistent. And we will be adding high-level documentation, and there will be more on that at the end. The key changes are more consistent attributes for people and organizations, better linking access, expanded use of type of XXX, so uh, type of sampling frame or type of procedure. Um, and so lining it up better with codebook, I mean, with lifecycle and with CDI, more consistent use of controlled vocabularies through the use of the element concept and how that's expressed within the schema. Uh, updated our internal enumerations. So codebook has a number of places where it had internal enumerations listing types of things. So we made sure that those were up to date. We added new DDI controlled vocabularies that were available. Um, the added metadata access information and the use of SDTL. Controlled vocabulary. In Codebook, hopefully you're familiar with this, is that uh, we've the primary means of expressing controlled vocabulary is now through concept. In the earliest editions of it, and still as a legacy throughout it, you will see attributes like type that were supposed to hold a controlled vocabulary term, but that was all they could do was hold the term. And so those have been deprecated in through documentation. In other words, not the best case, not the best place to use it, but there will be instructions on if you're working with legacy data, how you can update that, how you can align any new documentation with those legacy systems, particularly if you are having a search and display system that relies on those. And concept is kind of a standalone, but it is also used in conceptual text. Um, Many people don't use this option, but Codebook allows for mixed content in many of its string fields, so that you can have just text, or there are certain sets of internal tags you can put in. Some of those are just um, formatting, but the concept is used in conceptual text in a way that allows you to insert concepts mid-text and things. So those are our two approaches to expanding that use. To give you an idea, this is what a concept is in 2.5. It allows you to say, indicate the vocabulary, the URI of the vocabulary, if it's got a separate ID, the agency name, the version ID, and other value. In other words, if your controlled vocabulary, the option is other, you can indicate what that value really is in your situation. And the vocab scheme URN, which is kind of a leftover. Um, but when what we've added is the vocab instance URI, which is the specific identification URI for the term or code, and the vocab instance code term, so that the term goes into that specific slot. Um, how the documentation had originally read was that term was going into the text part of concept. This isn't actually how it's been used. People tend to put the label in there because they either did not have a way of indicating what the control vocabulary was, or they wanted that information to be there and visible and easy to present uh, in a search and display system, because they didn't have the ability to go back and um, resolve the link to the original full controlled vocabulary. What we have indicated now is that the string content of the element now contains the label in the specific language, because you can indicate the language that is being used there. And that allows you to have multiple language through the repeated use of concept. Your link is and you are still then being able to link them back to the same code term and URI. Um, I provided a few examples of this uh, to give you an idea of the kind of split we have in terms of what a label is and what a code is. So this is Library of Congress subject heading from the U.S. Here's its URI for the for the full controlled vocabulary. Here's the instance URI, which is SF311-312, and that is actually its code terms. And in the former directions, that is literally what you were supposed to have been putting into the text field. But what people were putting in was the actual label, draft horses. So you can see what we've done is allowing you the ability to do the resolution, indicate the specific item um, so that it's machine actionable, but also provide that terminology. And you could repeat this and have draft horses in whichever language you wanted to cover. Um, we've added locations for concept. Primarily, what we've done is gone through and changed what had been a simple text type to a concept type, and which adds the vocab URI, all of these additional pieces to support use of controlled vocabularies. We've added those to format, software, complete, which is the name of an element, doc status, imputation, and process statistics. And then we have locations where we change from simple text to conceptual text. All of these just add on options and don't remove any. So that is unit, instrument development, collector training, data processing, study classification, data appraisal, data checking, frequency, weight, minimum actions to minimize loss, availability status, response unit, and the update procedures. Um, Similarly, for agent identification, in 2.5 you could put in an abbreviation, an affiliation. Some things had roles. Um, many of many of them you'll see don't have role because the role is explicit in the name of the element that they are in, and a UR and URIs were only used for when it was pertinent. For example, in distribution. What we have added in 2.6 is the agent identifier. That is the identifier of the agent that is being described by the element, so the element content. The type of agent identifier, so that you can say uh, what what organization is managing that. You can indicate whether or not it's a persistent identifier, and indic indicate the agent type, which is, in other words, it's an organization or an individual. That is a set internal controlled vocabulary. We have Okay, and so those places that have gotten that information were the contact, the funding agency, other identification authorizing agency, original archive, data contributor, distributor, depositor, producer, evaluator, custodian, author entry, version responsibility, and participant. Um, there have been some issues around adding this information to other locations, and that is under discussion with the technical committee, particularly in locations where, so whether or not something is persistent with identifiers that are not agents. Um, and so that is under discussion. It was raised during the final review. Some examples are for, like, we have the originating archive, which in this case was cases. There's their URI, their agent identifier. It's an ROR identifier. It's persistent. And then the string content is Cases Leibniz Institute für Socialwissenschaften. Other ID, this is one that actually has the attribute of role because an other ID can cover a multitude of sins. In this case, that's the role was the editor. Their affiliation is INRA. The agency identifier is here. It's an ORCID ID, and it is persistent, and the name is Jane Smith. We were asked to provide better linkage to access information, particularly to provide access information, not just about the data, but access to the metadata itself. Um, this is becoming more and more important as people are working with information that needs to be protected. Whoops, that needs to be protected. Um, And so we wanted to be sure that we had that in there. And then we expanded the description of data access rules, created a parallel for metadata access rules, and then using the tool of ID refs at, sorry, I don't need to do that. We've provided an attribute access, which allows you to list one or more identifiers, internal identifiers, within the instance to point to the applicable access rules described in the study description. Because it's multiple, you could point both to one or more data access restrictions or situations and metadata access. These attributes were added to codebook, doc description, study description, file description, data item, data description, var group, ncube groups, var question category, value range, valid range, invalid range, summary statistics, standard category, um, sorry, category statistic, and ncube. Just a second, I'm going to mute myself so I can cough without. Thank you. What access information was added? The red was added in 2.6. So we've actually added a field type of access so you can provide a controlled vocabulary, external controlled vocabulary to organize your pieces of access information and license information. And that was added to the existing data access. We then replicated that minus the set availability so that there is a metadata access section immediately following the data access section so that you can have specific information about the metadata access. SDTL usage. As SDTL matured, they were learning a number of things about um, what information was useful to have in a structured way. So and other things that would make the use of the SDTL easier. Because Codebook um, is currently XML, and there is that assumption of order, and also the fact that, say, for variables, the orders of a variable, because of their use of location, either position in an array or the start and end position, frequently you are able to indicate a range of variables that are being used in, say, a derivation, um, particularly when you're talking about a full file derivation. That so we provided the ability to indicate variables being affected with a variable range um, element, and then added file derivation to the file description, which means you can actually describe the commands that were used to create a derived file, support for general description of command, and the use of SDTL in or similar context, and then being able to specify very explicitly what what variables were kept, what variables were dropped, and what variables were added. So in this one, when they created the new file, they retained variables 1, 2, and 5. They dropped variable 3, and then they added a variable 16 that had been created with um, the derivation process. So that's most of those are the technical things that were added. We then went on to review the field level documentation. Um, Adrian was very instrumental and helpful in getting this done by validating our field level, finding multiple typos, and making sure that anytime an element was referenced, that its name was written correctly. We added missing descriptions, added missing examples, attached documentation to the attributes, a documentation on the attributes to the attributes themselves, regularize the organization and layout of the documentation, and proof the documentation for accurate references to names. So that was a big project, and we appreciate his help with that. Um, One of the major reasons for doing this is a desire on the part of the technical committee to move away from proprietary tools in creating both in producing our schemas and our products, and in addition to their documentation, and we are looking to see what can be done to regularize the production of the field level documentation content. Having it in a consistent structure was a first step to that, and showed a number of places where we had adjusted how we were doing field level documentation to meet the idiosyncrasies of particular tools, and we wanted to make sure that we had something that was much more broadly applicable and easier and more consistent to put into another system. We have So there are outstanding issues and things that would go to the new codebook group, presentation of the field level documentation, and the style of the XML, particularly in terms of the internal documentations. Codebook uses its own unique style of XML schema, and it has caused some issues in our lives. There was also a request for high-level documentation. The documentation that's in Codebook at the moment is very focused on um, I'm talking about this element, and this is how this element is used, and here's an example of how this element is used. But there's not a lot there in terms of what the multiple levels of identification are and how those are used and how they differ from each other. What is the best way to handle, um, say, multiple bounding boxes when you've got geographic information, or defining a sample in terms of or subsamples in terms of a combination of their geographic location, time period, and maybe topical period. So when you've got many combined things, so for my experience from the IPUMS collections at the University of Minnesota, you may have subsamples that are India 2000 uh, women of childbearing age, maybe the actual sample that you have there. So how to actually um, get that expressed. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about doing some high level documentation, consistent um, use of controlled vocabularies, and how to use the access and referencing systems there. Um, so this is something that uh, we do have drafts of the high-level documentation that are they're being worked on. Those will be published as a separate document as we get the Codebook 2.6 published and out, and those will go under a review process for technical publications, which includes a technical review by people who um, understand the content, a comprehension review by people who would be using it, and then a publication, and that one does not require a vote. So it allows us to be more flexible in the publication and update of our technical documentation. Ha, we're down to the end. Questions. Um, Raise your hand. Ha. We've got, I think Jared will probably manage the question section, and I hope I have left sufficient time. This, by the way, is a new uh, email address. I'm getting to the point where someday along here, I will no longer be chair of the technical committee. And while people have traditionally sent things to Wendy or sent things to Liz, we do have a DDITC manager email that can be used to submit questions or to put in general queries. So I'm going to stop the share and let Jared take over.
Thanks, Wendy. So like Wendy said, feel free to ask questions, either raise your hand or put them into the chat. Just a reminder that this webinar is recorded, and so we'll post it on the DDI YouTube channel, as well as the slides to Zenodo. And those will be linked in the vote that's sent to member representatives later today or tomorrow when the vote goes out. And that vote will be for 30 days. So we'll open it up to you if anyone has questions. I'm not seeing questions. We'll just give one more opportunity if you want to raise your hand or post something into the chat.
Codebook, it's the old friend. They know it well.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. Like Wendy posted, you can always reach out to that email or reach out to the Alliance with questions. Otherwise, thanks for your participation and thanks to Wendy for presenting. Bye.